Okay, before I get started, I was gonna reference I'm winging this. I don't have a script. I'm just winging this. But I pulled up the old script I had when I was originally gonna make this video like 2 years ago, and I found the phrase "beats to eat meat slash pupate to." Okay, whatever. So, why should you listen to me? Or what are my qualifications? Well, I'd say I have two different categories of qualifications, which I'd call the fun and the serious. As far as the serious goes, I do have microbiology as my main hobby and specialization, and something that I actually have practical experience with, specifically and especially molecular biology, which I actually have experience with those techniques, so that's kind of what I actually have going on for me in real life. It's not much, but yeah, it would be really nice if you could call me Dr. Soonot, but you can't, so don't. As much as I really hate dealing with people, I'm super introverted, and I absolutely despise academic clickiness to astronomical extents. I wish I could say I was also involved in research, but my actual day job involves a lot of chemistry. So really my three things are microbiology, molecular biology, chemistry. Okay, good? Good. As far as the fun stuff goes, I've been into Spec Evo and Aliens since I was a little kid. I got StarCraft when I was really young, and I mained Zerg, and well, here I am now. I basically blame that for everything that happened afterwards. A persistent problem in the world-building community at large is a syndrome that I like to call realism OCD, where essentially if you can't confirm that your universe could literally coexist with us in real life, it just kind of drives you insane. The problem with this is that we're working with a really limited data set. The only example we have is the natural history of the Earth in one possible timeline of its development, which is really narrow. This mindset can lead to two potential major problems, which is number one, if you try to stick too strictly to what we know absolutely actually could happen, you end up squeezing out the speculative aspect of your project altogether and just copying real things that have happened. This alone might make your project boring because it's predictable, everyone can follow along with it, because if they know any natural history, they know how it goes step by step. But the second problem, which leads directly from the first, is that if you make a habit of this, you might downright be using these different events and scenarios out of context. A great example of this that I see that is best exemplified by fantasy world building often, but I've also seen in a lot of Spec Evo projects that have sapience in them, or so fonts, whatever you want to say, is taking an event such as industrialization and just kind of pasting it in without, first of all, sometimes I don't really see a very deep understanding of the social context and economic context that goes into this event. A lot of people seem to have the impression this was just an advancement in technology, which it was, but that is definitely not all that it is. But there will also be this subconscious feeling that this is all somehow inevitable. Like, I can almost see if they took it a step further to the digital age, like characters in your universe using mobile phones as if the Apple Corporation made them. Like, I think all of this can be boiled down to an effect that essentially the past in our world looks like it was inevitable because the present simply wouldn't exist without the past going exactly the way that it did. But this is of course an illusion. The past didn't have to go the way that it did. What this illusion causes is that we'll see a lot of things that are honestly just present for no particularly good reason as inevitable and required and necessary. A lot of things in our past get mistaken as requirements as opposed to just things that happened that led to now. There easily could have been a different set of events. A great example of this that really annoys me is people who argue that you need to have a large Jovian to have a habitable planet. It's true, the Earth would not be remotely the same if Jupiter didn't exist, but first of all, the claim that Jupiter caused large objects to avoid collision with the Earth is such a ridiculous claim. It is completely, first of all, pretty much unprovable. Second of all, we literally had a period in Earth's history called the Late Heavy Bombardment. I don't know how that sounds like the Jovians are protecting us, but okay. But even if we were able to trace back that claim and prove that Jupiter caused less collisions in the inner solar system, that's just why Earth is the way it is. That suggests nothing about its necessity to the origin of life. It was necessary for the origin of Earth life as it exists today. Was it even necessary for the origin of Earth life, period? I don't know. This is where tip number 2 comes in. Work from the bottom up. These things might be necessary, possibly, but what's more important is to look at the underlying causes that you're actually interested in. When we're looking at do living planets need a Jovian neighbor to help them out, what you're actually asking is, how much do collisions with asteroids and comets matter? And what do you want to do about it? That's what you're actually asking. If you narrow this down in your brain to Jovian or no Jovian, this is a completely false binary that literally does not help you at all. This is similar to the industrialization scenario I showed earlier, where I've seen this a lot, where it's not like it's impossible. Obviously, industrialization is a thing that happens, but it'll be shown as if it would happen the same way it did here. It'll almost be like a copy of British industrialization, step for step, when the questions you should be asking are, what is the social context? And if it does happen, how will it be different from the industrialization we know? Because again, it's not like convergent evolution isn't a thing that happens. You can have aliens with guns, but show your work. Why does this look so familiar? It's an alien gun. There's a lot more than one way to do projectile weapons, okay? Gosh. Tip number 3, make sure you have clear goals. If you actually want to successfully avoid just taking random cubic segments of natural history and just kind of stapling them together without any understanding of how they connect, you're just kind of filling in templates. You need to make sure there's an overall direction, an artistic direction that you're actually going for. This includes questions like, what are you willing to explore? How comfortable are you with alternate chemistries, with doing your own climate science? And depending on the answers to those questions, how are you going to get there? I might graphically represent the goal-making process like this, where essentially we have an endpoint and a start point. And there's a dialogue going on between these two, where when you work on one, you need to update the other, and this is kind of what leads to your project just evolving as you work on it. The reason to make sure you keep up with this process is because if you keep these 2 points fixed and rigid and in a linear relationship, you end up having to pull a lot of contrivances out of your ass to actually make this work. But if you do this process correctly, you'll end up with a narrative where people will look at it and they'll go, oh, I can see how this all organically builds up to sharks with laser eyes. Whereas if you don't, and your goals or your start point end up kind of out of line with what's actually going on, you'll end up with these contrived events in the middle where people will look at it and go, oh, this is just because they wanted sharks with laser eyes. Okay. If you're doing a more exploratory speculative project, it's still good to have a goal of what you want to explore. What concepts and environments do you actually want to probe into? I think this all originates with the commonly understood concept that a blank canvas is way harder to work with than a canvas that has a little bit of something on it. Because with a blank canvas, you could make anything. It's just too open. It's really hard to start. Whereas when you have just a few start points, you can build an entire image around those start points. Our first example will be Luna, our moon. It's a great example of Earth chauvinism because a lot of the conversation around it is about how life couldn't possibly exist without the moon, when the correct things to be thinking when looking at the moon are, number 1, what are the prerequisites for Earth life as it exists today that the moon brings into the equation, and 2, what other sources are there for those prerequisites, and are they even necessary for the existence of life, period? So we're both going to work from the bottom up here and make sure we have clear goals. One thing we know is that, for example, the moon formed incredibly close to the Earth, and so significantly slowed the Earth's rotation as it was pushed out into a further orbit. The question is, was that 100% necessary for the existence of life? The main thing I hear people talk about is how it was necessary for photochemistry as we recognize it to really exist. So now the question is, what are you comfortable experimenting with? Do you want to see if there's a different Earth that you want to try out? Something with a different photochemistry or less significant photochemistry? No photochemistry? And if you still want to slow the rotation of the Earth, how do you want to do that? Maybe a captured body somehow? Or maybe you want to slow down the Earth's rotation by having your planet be a moon around a Jovian, which has definitely its pros and cons. I would also suggest a close proximity to a star would definitely slow down the rotation over time, but that can be kind of deadly. So another thing people find very important are the tides. Because of the moon's orbit, it tugs on the Earth's surface, and so we have low and high tides of the ocean, which creates intertidal zones where life could more easily transition from sea to land. How necessary do you consider that? Would you consider creating an alternative? If you still want to have an intertidal zone, are there any other ways to even do such a thing? Those are all the kinds of questions you should be asking. This leads me into my next tip: know the rules before you break them. And don't just know the rules, but know why the rules are there. Don't just know, don't just hear from people, intertidal zone equals transition to land. Understand what are the principles at play that make an intertidal zone favorable to that occurring, and actually figure out how that works, how that whole event worked out, what were the prerequisites that went into it, what happened. And once you know what worked, you can break the rules and try to do something else, but you have to make sure you fundamentally understand what you're talking about. This includes, in this case, understanding maybe the difference between the circumstances that led arthropods on the land and how often that happened versus, say, the tetrapods getting to land. These are the kinds of events where you'd look at the details to see what is it that actually even drives this to happen. Oh yeah, and plants. Everyone always talks about animals, nobody talks about how cool it is that plants got on the land. That's way more awesome. This kinda leads us into tip number 5, which is to dare to be wrong. Whether you're doing very light Spec Evo or you're doing hard Spec Evo, you should be ready to say things that, whether or not we are extrapolating really far away from known science, so it's kind of in the blurry zone where we know what would be roughly realistic, but we're kind of extrapolating really hard. Or whether you're working really close to the bounds of what we know. If you're doing this stuff, people are gonna be like, that's so unrealistic, and and sometimes they'll be right too. They'll be right that you are completely wrong about how stuff works. That is okay. More importantly, I think it's actually more important to set your own personal goals and expectations for how realistic and in what ways this project is going to meet your standards. I wouldn't even use the word realistic. I would just focus on what are your standards for what you want your project to look like. Is this more leaning into a bit of fantasy? Are there kind of some weird rules at play here that are kind of just a little bit cheaty for you that are there? Or is this we're kind of assuming some things? What are you comfortable with assuming? These are all rules that you need to set up for yourself. And this also kind of falls back into realism OCD, where no matter how hard you try, it's gonna be impossible to say we could coexist with your fantasy world. So just make something fun. Have fun. That's literally all I'm asking. One of the other purposes of this rule is, obviously I'm not telling you to just make up stuff off the top of your head, because then it's no fun. If there's no rules and it's just some kind of weird, trippy, dream-like story, I mean, myths are cool too, but it's just not that interesting, especially when there's no logical justification for everything happening. It's just really not that interesting. But more, this also serves the function to make sure that you're conscious you're doing these things, because you're going to be doing these things whether you think about it or not. And a lot of the times when I see people get super defensive of their projects, honestly, the whole problem would be solved if they just were conscious of what they were assuming. Because people can come in and yell at you like, oh, your project sucks so bad. But whether they're right or wrong, it really won't bother you as much if, you also are conscious of what you're assuming. So, and again, other people's opinions aren't going to matter a whole lot to you when you're like, I know I assumed that, or you're just like, yeah, I kind of figured I'd left that as a blind spot. I'm not sure I'm a fan of that either, as opposed to going in being like, I'm gonna make the most realistic thing ever. I'm gonna make the most realistic thing ever with no conscious thought put into the limitations on what I can do. And then when people say, hey, it's not the most realistic thing ever, I'm gonna go, no, you're just dumb. Alright, now we're moving more into the alt-chem stuff, so this should be a lot easier to apply and less broad and more practical. Tip number 7, please remember the laws of thermodynamics. If you're making an ecosystem, just remember that there's entropy, that every step of digestion, you're losing some energy to heat. You can't have an ecosystem 90% predator, 10% herbivore. Even on Earth, pure carnivores are incredibly rare. It's a spectrum. They're not categories. Like, please, just stop with the obsession with predators. I know that people think predators are cool, but just chill. And I could go on about this in so many other specific circumstances, but I'm just gonna kind of reiterate, please remember the laws of thermodynamics. And I'll give one more example, which is please don't fall for the Matrix type thing. In the Matrix series, humans are used as a power source for the Matrix. The problem is that the energy going into running a robot civilization and simulating the Earth is a little bit more than the power you get from a human farm. So just try to avoid stuff like that, where your food sources and energy sources are just vastly, overwhelmingly, just in the negatives. Just try to be careful. Tip number 8 is remember your dissociation energies. This one, what I mean by this is to remember the very basic rule that molecules that are very unstable belong in cold environments. Molecules that are very stable are going to act more dynamically in hot environments. Great example of this that really annoys me, when people talk about silicon-based life, they'll do one of two things. They'll either they'll just replace carbon with silicon and talk about silanes, and they'll be like, oh, silanes are bad because this, and this property, and they explode on Earth. Yeah, no shit, there's no silicon-based life on Earth, at least not up here. So, yeah, duh, they're not great here. But also, second of all, I'll hear people talk about it and they'll cover it like this. They'll be like, silicon-based life might be great for extreme conditions, such as extreme cold or heat. What does that mean? If you're a layperson hearing that, or even anyone hearing that, what are they referring to? It's stupid. It's a stupid thing to say. Don't talk about it like that. But silicon is a great example of this rule. If you wanted to do a project, let's say, like, in liquid dinitrogen on Pluto, some Plutonian planet or something. That is way outside anything I've ever done, but let's say you're doing that for some reason. In that case, you would use silanes, because they're highly unstable, and they're going to be way more chill and, like, generally chemically manageable at those low temperatures. If you wanted to do something in a hot planet, we're talking, like, magma, like molten salt, molten metal. There's a reason these projects are rare. That's a hard one. And by hard, I mean, I don't even know where to get started. Good luck. The only thing I'd say is magma's too high viscosity, so I would just find something weird. Anyways, if you're doing that, in that case, you would use something where silicon's in a high oxidation state, like silicon dioxide, because that's normally just rock, but it'll be acting much more dynamically when it's all hot and melty. So that's just the general rule. Unstable molecules need to be cold. Stable molecules need to be hot. If you're doing alt chemistry, just there you go. There's your rule. Tip number 9 is source your elements. And what I mean by this is it's a lot harder to just say I want to have more of this element while there is some heterogeneity in galaxies and in between different star systems and star types, stellar classifications. It's really hard to really significantly make, like, let's say you're doing a really sulfur heavy project. You want to have like a liquid hydrogen sulfide or sulfuric acid type planet, right? And you need a lot of sulfur. It's really hard to just go like, it'll be a sulfur planet with a lot of sulfur, because, like, where is all this sulfur coming from exactly? A really difficult element, for example, would be nitrogen. Nitrogen is really hard to follow, and I've read so many papers about nitrogen in protoplanetary nebulae and stuff, and I I just can't track this stuff down. No matter how hard I try, I cannot get this stuff to just land on my damn planet. Like, either we just don't know enough, or it's just a piece of crap. I hate nitrogen so much. It's not hard to get enough nitrogen for, like, an Earth-type ecosystem. Like, we have a lot of general theories about how you could do that, and we know enough about where nitrogen is located in a system that you can absolutely do that, or, you know, have a collision between bodies or differentiation or something, degassing. But if you want to do an ammonia sea project, I don't know what to tell you. I've had one for a long time. That planet, like, the ideas behind it are well developed. Where the planet is so many questions on that one. So this is a case where when you're doing this, it's a lot easier to do differentiation instead of just finding the element. The annoying thing about nitrogen is that it's a very volatile element most of the time, so if you have a planet like that's really huge, it's probably not going to collect a super like concentrated dose of nitrogen because it's just so big that it has so much other stuff. If you have a smaller planet, as the planet degasses, like nitrogen is really going to be one of those first things getting out, even if it's not a very differentiated planet, and it's going to just screw off into space. Nitrogen is just really, I hate it. But when it comes to a lot of other elements, you can usually, through differentiation, avoid the requirement for the contrivance of like, oh, this planet is just 98% made of sulfur. Like, why? For example, you could take inspiration from Io if you're doing a sulfur project, where you might have to figure out how to balance out volcanism with a larger planet with an atmosphere to not, like, just overheat it, or maybe you want it hot, who knows. But Io, for example, spits out a lot of sulfur because it has an iron sulfide core and it's very volcanic, and you could take inspiration from that kind of activity and create a body that has a lot of sulfur just spewed out onto the surface. There's not more sulfur in the body than average, like maybe a little more than average in the system, but not like crazy. But you have your sulfur planet, there you go. It's also worth considering that you can remove material just as much as you can add material from another body, because there's the consideration of the material actually in the belt where your planet forms that will be part of its coalescing mass, but also massive collisions. I mean, think the Earth, or perhaps think primary and secondary atmospheres. Like, do you want to keep your primary atmosphere to try and get a lot more hydrogen into the surface? Like, it probably won't stick around, but do you want more hydrogen just kind of sticking around in the surface geology, or just stored up in the center of the planet? Do you want the planet itself to be really differentiated? Do you want to scrape off that first atmosphere and create a secondary atmosphere that's more like what you want to see? These are the kinds of things that will help you try to kind of move these elements around where you want them to be. It's a lot more important to remember that you're just looking for, like in most projects, you're just doing the surface. You're looking for surface conditions that are what you want, and not necessarily making the whole planet very heavy in one element. So that's really important to consider. It's also important to consider geological cycles, how they might suck up or spit out certain elements. They might extract certain elements from the surface and lock it away. How do you get it back up there? Or how do you just get more of it up there in general? A lot of these kinds of questions. This is how you're going to move around elements. You are never, unless you need to be a little bit, you're hardly ever gonna really be lucky without people being like, wow, that's like really, this is really contrived. So kind of depends what you're willing to deal with, but be my guest. Tip number 10 is avoid discrete thinking, or like black and white thinking. It's very important to remember that species are not like individual units. Like, we're talking about like kind of a fluid of populations, right? This is especially useful in understanding convergent evolution. Convergent evolution not only happens when two species try to occupy the same niche and so they kind of make similar adaptations, but what fundamentally drives convergent evolution is also shared characteristics that lead to those similar solutions, or make it more likely to approach those same solutions. For example, if you look at the archaeological record for turtles and turtle-like animals, just within the family that's surrounding the true turtles. I don't use the family term scientifically, by the way, just like roughly. If you were to look at that record, like, we don't know that we're looking at direct ancestors of turtles at all, and yet there are so many of these populations that are going down the same path because their common ancestors/ancestors were already kind of going down this path anatomically, and so we actually see many multiple species going this direction, a lot of variation. So basically the takeaway there is that similar anatomies are going to cause similar convergent evolutions. So the more closely related two animals are, or two species are, ironically, the more likely they're kind of to move in unison in one direction. It's a little bit funny. This is important to remember not only so you don't just apply convergent evolution haphazardly, where like it's happening between distant relatives for no reason, but animals that look exactly the same differentiate in totally weird ways for no reason. This is also important to remember because knowing that species aren't like a discrete unit, like this is like a category, a box that we come up with when it becomes distinct and clear enough that it's easier to say, okay, these are distinct species. It will just help you a lot with getting a more dynamic result out of your work where it's not just like the narrative of a single character. When you're talking about the evolution of a species, it isn't just branching, it is an overflowing, messy fluid, and that'll get you a lot more interesting stories when you look at it this way. There are going to be weird creatures, weird offshoots of your favorite creatures that die off for no reason, that just existed, or even maybe a weird offshoot that ends up being really influential later in the history of your project. Lots of stuff like that. Very interesting things. Please remember to do this. Don't be too discreet. If you are going to have a project where you can only manage, like, say, in your head, you can only manage, like, say, 6 species at a time within a kingdom. Like, let's say, like, 6 rough genre within a kingdom at a time. You're just not wanting to bother with all this little detail. Make sure to keep in mind that those genre are covering very broad umbrellas. Like, honestly, it can be kind of cool to just have a broad setup like that, and then you're more open to creature design where you're not so limited by the intense vigor of like trying to check every little detail, and you can kind of apply a creature design of your choice to one of your existing genre and be like, hey, look at this dude, he's cool, he reasonably could exist, he's within this genre that I did evolve step by step, but this dude I just kind of came up with because it was cool. That's a decent mix if that's the kind of project you want to do, of just pure artistic direction, which there should always be artistic direction, but like pure artistic direction, and some good world building and science. That's cool. Our last tip number 11, is avoid social Darwinism. What the heck do I mean by this? Basically, just avoid the overemphasis on competition. Social Darwinism, as a general mindset and approach to biology, it has this overtone as well of like progressing to higher forms, which the concept of a higher form in biology is completely just, it makes no sense. It's completely irrelevant and means nothing in biology. You could, if you want, talk about, I wouldn't even use the word more advanced, I'd talk about more derived forms and more basal forms, but the concept of advancement or upward progress makes no sense in biology. The main reason I say avoid this is because it'll really make you focus entirely only on the really boring and very like actually specific circumstances of certain competitive scenarios. Like whenever people think of evolution, they always think of predator-prey dynamics, right? That's a really common one. They think of like the cheetah and the gazelle or something. Gazelle just keeps getting faster and faster, the cheetah gets faster, whatever. The problem with this, of course, is that this is like a small portion of what evolution is. This is a humongous, and I won't even talk about the other parts about it. I won't talk more about outside of this context, but within Spec Evo, it is just an enormous roadblock to the creativity a lot of people have. Like, I've seen people come up with like eusocial copycats, where they'll copy like eusocial ants and stuff, because those exist and those are very obvious and well known. But the cooperative and, well, really it's the only word for it, the cooperative aspects of ecosystems are just totally left out most of the time. Like, I have never seen a single project come up with anything even remotely equivalent to a biofilm. A biofilm is a bacterial colony of many species of bacteria which cooperate and balance each other out, and even may have an immune function to keep out other bacteria which might exploit the colony. Cooperation is the norm in nature, even if predation as a phenomena might defy our definitions of what kindness and cooperation looks like. That's really because you're thinking from a human perspective. Humans don't eat each other. That's good human cooperation. Predation, really anything in nature, doesn't really fall neatly into any of our categories. So just don't think in terms of social Darwinism. Focus more on what actually helps these creatures survive. In the end, that is what natural selection is. It is simply selection for those creatures which can propagate themselves, right? I prefer personally not to use the term reproduction, because propagating a species can involve a lot more than just the reproductive moment, if we call it that. If you just focus on that, you will leave out a lot of features which we see in real life that are super cool and super complicated, and you will totally come up with other weird stuff that does not exist on Earth. As long as you don't focus on it like that. We care about the propagation through time just as well as space of our species as we do, just having numbers, right? Like, we care about these species surviving. That's the actual selection process, not just reproduction. That's why there's different reproduction strategies. That's why there's individuals who don't seem to really contribute directly to reproduction, which confuses people all the time. I really don't know why it does, because there's a lot of phenomena that are very easy to understand when you don't narrow your thinking down to, again, what I would call this reproductive moment. Especially when you consider the amount of genetic material which is actually transmitted to like a 100th generation from its ancestors in, like, say, a binary sexual reproduction, such as among mammals. Like, it's a bit weird. It's a bit silly to just narrow it down to that moment. The other thing to point out is, of course, that ecosystems need to be well regulated and cooperating. Even if you don't come up with a biofilm type scenario, if you don't have, if for some reason that's just not something you're interested in, or you're just not doing, or it just downright for some reason you don't think it can exist in your context, ecosystems overall still need to be stable, right? We can't have an ecosystem that allows an individual species to just consume everything to keep going, right? And this also includes resources in general. They need to be getting cycled. So you need to make sure that your ecosystems aren't just competitive, but highly cooperative as well. And what that behavior looks like, and again, cooperative and competitive are just words we use. They don't actually mean anything. They're categories that humans use in relation to human social relations. They don't apply outside of a human context. They really don't. What that behavior looks like, what good ecosystems look like, depends on the context of the project you're doing. Some harsher ecosystems are probably going to require a lot more cooperation, or what we would identify as cooperation, as opposed to, let's say, an incredibly overabundant ecosystem, which may have so much energy in it that it sustains a very highly carnivorous population. Something like that. That's kind of what is important to know there. So that is that tip. That tip is just, that's a pretty broad one, I guess, when I think about it, but this just, don't do social Darwinism, okay? Just be a little more complicated with your work. Have a little bit of, think a little bit out the box, okay? Thank you. So now is the self-serving self-insert part, where I can give a few of my projects where I think I've at least applied some of this, just to give examples to help you kind of imagine doing this yourself. The first project is by far the oldest, and unfortunately all of these are old because I haven't had the time to work on this stuff for a while, a long time. I love working, it's so fun, I love working all the time, I love overtime. Anyways, the first of these is going to be a project very old called Dust. Not really a lot to show here, but essentially the concept behind Dust was to have a completely uninhabitable surface environment, just really nothing to work with, which probably would have been served better by a Pangea type arrangement, but I don't quite remember what I did here exactly. I just remember the surface is uninhabitable, and we have, I guess the reason there's not a Pangea is because it's very important to have this global ocean circulation, so that the ocean fully wraps around the entire planet. The concept behind this was to probably have photosynthetic animals, or at least photosynthetic symbiont animals, where we might have like an algae type thing growing on the back of some animals that are some kind of aquatic animals that migrate along with the rotation of this planet. Actually, yeah, I believe that was why the surface was uninhabitable, was because it's very slow rotation. But what we see here is a good example of starting with a goal, right? Like I have a goal of what I wanted to do. I wanted to have photosynthetic animals of some kind. And I also just didn't want to worry about the surface. I kind of wanted the surface geology to just be very primitive, right? I didn't want to have too many minerals leaching back into the water thanks to the activity of life or anything. I wanted it to be pretty harsh. So, starting from that premise, I kind of set up the whole system, set up the planet, and then I was able to make conditions that would be predisposed to kind of causing that. From there, I was able to come up with any other weird things that might happen. And I remember originally I was going to make a Bibluridian type series about this project years ago. Yeah, it wasn't worth it. I made some models though. Here are some of them. They're really, really bad. These are old. This is when I was learning Blender. Next we have AOP, which I just literally spelled with the letters AOP. Very creative. This was a project where the goal was, how do you get life on... Well, there's two goals, two ideas that I had at the time that I wanted to experiment with, and they kind of just merged together. First of all, was there some kind of way to have like a decentralized macroscopic organism, like kind of like in a way, a multicellular prokaryote type thing, something like that, something really weird like that? And second of all, how to transition onto land when the land is completely uninhabitable and there's no intertidal zone to work with. What eventually happened here was a project where the planet starts with a lot of water, but that water is slowly being boiled off, so not as rapidly as like a Martian scenario, but we're talking about a very slowly dehydrating planet. And what the creatures on the world have to do is essentially they have to find a way to preserve the water in order to stay alive. And the way this is evolved, the pressure that causes this is basically small pools kind of all over the place, because it's a very rainfall heavy planet at first, so there's kinds of and geologically a lot of the rocks are not very porous, so there's a lot of these pools all over the place and they're slowly evaporating, and within these pools there's a lot of chances for a little mini ecosystem to develop that actually preserves the water, makes it more saline, and kind of becomes more halophilic. All the organisms become more halophilic, and eventually this spreads into the remains of the oceans, and we get the one really cool feature of this planet, which you can see in this very old render from one of my old videos. That old video, by the way, pretty outdated. Pretty much the moment it was released, I did a redo of a lot of the statistics and math behind it, so those descriptions are very inaccurate. Not super inaccurate, but they're pretty off. The math isn't great. Temperatures are off. Yeah. But what we see is the coolest feature of AOP, which is this one remaining fully liquid body, which is really more alive than dead, honestly. And it's this pink eye kind of just sitting here, the last body of water preserved. Now, all this red stuff is from basically these organisms, these bacteria and other things. I'm sure there's eukaryote equivalents too, I don't quite remember. They all kind of cooperate to kind of push the water out onto the surface. And the benefit of this is that by covering more of the planet, if something happens somewhere climactically, it doesn't kill literally everything. So we end up seeing that even if the surface itself just refuses to be habitable and there's no intertidal zone, they just slowly transport and push the water out, creating these very thin mats. And I have another graphic here kind of showing what it looks like. Again, this is some really old stuff, but this was a really cool concept, and it all just started with the goal. I made the starting conditions that would kind of push towards this goal, and all these other things, the mat, the fluid preservation, the giant pink like eye feature, all of these just kind of naturally developed over the course of the project. As far as the prokaryotes went, that was not my best thing. It was a bit contrived. It was just kind of like, hey, this whole decentralized mat of like bacterial type life forms, like what if we had an archaea bacteria type thing that just like was able to stay very dry, right? Because it doesn't have these big complicated structures like nuclei or anything. What if it's just kind of these dry sacks of RNA and DNA that just kind of use physics to kind of crawl around the desert? And that's basically where the concept of like crawlers came from. I won't even post a drawing of it or anything because there's nothing showing them, but imagine these stringy red things kind of just ever so slowly crawling across the world, kind of moving in a motion similar to like tumbleweed, but more methodically. That would have been interesting, but that wasn't really ever fleshed out. Boroa was a project that was supposed to be an ammonia planet, or a liquid ammonia planet. The idea was that this life would be based on boron nitride, which was a very cool concept. And honestly, boron nitride and ammonia is really cool. I'm actually going to talk about this one outside the context of the tips because there's really not much to say here. The main thing that sucked about this, that never let it really go anywhere because I was obsessed with it, was why is all this ammonia here? Other than that, once the ammonia is there, the geological effects of ammonia are just really cool. Like really, really cool. None of these colors probably accurately reflect it like at all, but very awesome stuff. And especially here's like this weird cube I made that was never finished, but it was supposed to eventually represent the anatomy of these kinds of bodies of ammonia. They never can get that deep, of course, because there's not that much liquid ammonia to go around, but they're definitely deep enough. They're there. And you can see this frozen ammonia ice at the bottom that kind of has these pockets of volcanism in there. So there's like these isolated pockets of chemistry happening within these ammonia ice sheets, which are mostly formed by pressure. Now, what was really cool, and again, totally outside the tips, is just because I felt like it, is the geometry and chemistry, like potential chemistry of borazane or boron, nitrogen, hydrogen type molecules. These are really cool, and I'm just going to talk about the geometry of them really quick because that's what I did the most work on, and it's sick as hell. So I'm not going to talk too much about the chemistry of borazanes, although them being like super polar and stuff is also really cool. But they also are just highly asymmetrical and awesome. Borazanes have like 4 potential configurations that can really be imagined. Those being, and I'm just going to put out names here, transoid, transisoid, helicoid, and coiled forms. I believe the forms that I settled on that were the most stable, from what I could tell, were the helicoid. Those were the ones that I decided to stick with. The other ones, like transoid, is probably like a local minimum, but it's not the most stable, so we'll just stick with the most stable conformer. This I actually made 3D models of, based off the work of one paper on the subject, which I did this like, what, 4 years ago? I don't have this anywhere, so unfortunately, I can't give proper credit where it's due, but regardless of whether I could or not, take this with a million grains of salt. Like, this is not the gospel. This is just a model of what it might possibly look like. But regardless, it looks very twisty and cool, so I just thought that was badass, honestly. And beyond just the geometry, you can imagine how many weird asymmetrical conformers we'll get, first of all. Like, so many weird things could happen with this. Like, what even would be the handedness preference when so many things are handed like this? Like, it would be alternating and weird and just, But if we imagine this chemically, too, my initial assumption ages ago was, for example, that alcohols might have an equivalent in thiol groups here. But also we have to consider other unique structures that could exist here. Like, for example, we have alternating boron-nitrogen, so we could internally have boron-boron or nitrogen-nitrogen bonds serve as their own functional group. That would be awesome. And of course, there's other features to consider, like, for example, the structure for ethane might be isoelectronic with just borazane, but propane, like, you can't really have this isn't isoelectronic with propane. So if everything's always got to be in pairs, like, what does this represent as a functional group in the metabolic chemistry of a theoretical species? Like, a lot of cool questions like that. So that's always kind of been like my pet for chemistry is Boroa. It's not my favorite project when I get to it because I just don't know where it is, because ammonia, I hate it. I've never hated ammonia so much. Now, my last and all-time favorite, like, kind of self-insert project would have to be tar, which I've also referred to as vial sometimes. I'm not sure which of these names is canon, but we have a surface picture here. This was made in Space Engine, where I did a little bit of modification to how the surface looks, but while this is not even remotely canonical, because obviously I didn't even make this feature, this surface, I threw some things in there, like the smooth indented planes and stuff like that, that are like features that would be canon to it. It's just know that the planet doesn't look anything like this, but these are in fact things that are on it. So it's kind of textured like this, so to speak, especially including the color gradients. But anyways, the idea behind tar was I wanted to have carbon disulfide as my solvent. The reason being that for some reason I've always been obsessed with having a really, really thin atmosphere project, and carbon disulfide has one of the widest ranges as far as liquid temperatures. So the way this is done is, first of all, a brown dwarf star is used so that we can get a carbonaceous planet, because there is some theory around that the terrestrial planets that would form around a brown dwarf, I mean, even on the outskirts, they're probably just going to be ice planets. We're not really going to see Jovians, hopefully, but if we're going to have like a terrestrial system, we're not having like twin brown dwarfs or anything. If we're going to have a terrestrial system, we're probably going to see carbon planets and then like large Neptunian ice planets. That's probably what we're going to see. And these inner carbonaceous planets, when they form initially, they're going to be hot, and then there's going to be a lot of tidal forces too. So what this is going to do is give us a lot of volcanism to spew stuff out onto the surface and differentiate this planet, right? And so it's all carbon. So it's going to be like kind of titanium and carbon in the mantle, and then obviously like a titanium iron carbon mantle, right, type of stuff, sulfur, iron sulfide. But we're going to spit a lot of sulfur out onto the surface. At first, when this planet first forms, obviously with a cool brown dwarf, there's also going to be a lot of water around. Water is probably going to impact this planet a lot. So we're probably going to start out with carbonyl sulfide. But over time, as the atmosphere that initially forms with the planet, which could be pretty thick, even if it's very small, as that gets scraped off, the hope is that the lighter element, oxygen, gets scraped off while, of course, sulfur and then solid carbon just kind of stay behind. Over time, that carbonyl sulfide mixed carbon sulfide ocean, as the planet ages, turns more into smaller pools of just pure carbon sulfide. And the thing about carbon sulfide is that when impacted by photons, it can just turn into kind of a solid. And so the hope was that a kind of protective mat forms as the atmosphere disappears that kind of creates these dark, unlit pools of carbon sulfide that just kind of exist, which would have been so, so cool. Now, if you're looking at these really old slides that I made, you can kind of see how we have all these elements moving around, and then we have a little bit of tectonic activity, and as the planet ages, it loses most of its activity. And we kind of end up in this final dead state where we're still getting some more stuff onto the surface, but it's not enough to fully degas the planet. The crust has solidified to the point where it's at least keeping stuff in now, so we're not just going to lose everything, but there's still like a consistent spewing of stuff, enough to at least retain a very thin atmosphere and keep that from just disappearing because it's constantly being replenished. So this particular planet, not as much rigor behind this one as the Boroa project, but I've often imagined a chemistry based mostly on aluminum, sulfur, and carbon. That I always thought would be really cool. The aluminum, kind of just thrown in there. I really want it to work. Have not been able to address this problem in a long time, so don't know how that'll work out, but that was the original intent of this. Now, what's really cool are the aesthetic and like kind of physiological goals that this project actually started with, which was mainly a focus on a low light environment, B, magnetotrophy, which debatably possible with how close this planet's orbit is. It's at least definitely possible at the start of its life. Magnetotrophy, its possibility to sustain ecosystems, it's a little more questionable as you get into like the billions of years range, but I don't know, we'll see. And C, asymmetrical body types. This is the main one. Now, if we were to look at like a cross section of like one of these crater pool environments, right? One of the things that you'll see here is that we kind of have this environment which might encourage kind of asymmetrical developments, because there are like 6 distinct sides to really consider. There's the side you'll have facing away from the center of the crater, the one towards the center of the crater, towards the surface, towards, beneath you, and then front or back, if we're kind of thinking of that here in like a great circle around this pool. It kind of matters a little less. But this kind of thing could encourage asymmetry, and especially because the entire planet is tidally locked, even at the surface. Even if we were talking about surface life, we might be talking about asymmetry. Any life living in large caves as well, maybe it would be okay to get away with, especially since we don't have to worry about sight. And navigation itself will be more decentralized, because we're mostly going to be navigating by touch and by feeling. So getting away might be a more decentralized process. Like if we're trying to escape a predator, cephalization might just not be the most favorable way. It might still happen, but it might be a very minor position in the greater scheme of body plans. There is also technically a fourth major goal, which was just looking at cooperation taken to its like logical extreme. So this is an environment where this ecosystem seriously has to do some work if it's going to survive, let alone propagate further into the environment. So this is a ecosystem that is going to be highly defensive of its own internal order, and we're also going to see species which are doing a net excess metabolism of stuff like creating more carbon disulfide, right? Like hopefully we'll see creatures which in their metabolic process were producing more, or at least of other less energetically favorable things which might dilute the carbon disulfide but at least produce more fluids or lead eventually to the release in some way. It's up to, I mean, it could even be an energy inputting process. I mean, everything here needs it to live, so it might not even be a byproduct, it might be the product of the metabolism of some of these creatures down here. And like, let's say we have a bacteria which did this, it would kind of get a protected status within this ecosystem. Like, it would be something that you can't really be screwing with, or the whole ecosystem would collapse. So how would the ecosystem adapt to protect individuals like that? That would be interesting to see. We also consider just creating more habitable space, like how might we, starting in this pool, kind of dig out into the surroundings, excavate the terrain around them. This might naturally happen because of deposits of minerals which might be chemotrophically useful, that might produce some energy, and this could cause cave-ins and create more spaces to live in. But this is also very interesting because now we have access to these very heterogeneous environments. Caves are very heterogeneous. We could have pockets of all kinds of different gases trapped, different strange solutions and fluids and environments. So this is very interesting. This is just a very interesting planet in general, where we also have a lot of subterranean possibilities here, which are some of my favorites. And it's not quite like a hollow planet project, which is something I've tried before, and those are definitely a cool thing to think about. But this is more reasonable and within what is at least kind of familiar, where we're caving around, but it's like still near the surface. We're not doing any crazy thing where we're like living at the center of Vesta or something. It's a little bit weird. It's a little bit weird, kind of really hard to wrap your head around. I guess there is one last thing still that was really interesting that I wanted to cover in this project, which is the idea of de-evolution. So the general purpose of this is that during the early period of this planet's life, it is a lot warmer, and of course the temperature is a lot more constant than later on. Since this planet is tidally locked, it's tidally locked and also orbiting fast enough, because you have to remember that when a planet is tidally locked, it's still rotating. It just rotates in sync with its orbit. It's rotating fast enough and still tidally locked that there will be kind of this zone that creates this sort of polar current. Like, there will be this asymmetrical kind of weird polar current which kind of isolates the poles, making them a lot colder than their surroundings. This only happens later on. Initially, this will still be there as like a thing, but the whole planet is just a lot warmer and there's a thicker atmosphere. So the general consideration is when the planet cools down significantly, not only are we talking about living in an entirely different temperature range, like the final temperature that these guys are living in, like they'll probably be in areas which are about like minus 100, minus 110 to like 50, 60, negative 50, negative 60 degrees Celsius. That's like what we're looking at. Whereas initially this planet is kind of just all over pretty warm, and even later on, like the equator is like minus 50, right? Whereas it's only the poles that are really habitable like that. So we're talking about oceans that used to have a lot more oxygen in them, like carbonyl sulfide. There's a lot more oxygen hanging out in there. They lose that oxygen and they also get way colder. How do you even become suited for that environment starting from a point where you evolved, like your entire like kingdom of life started in these in these early conditions? That's kind of just what it's predestined to be in, right? The idea is possibly some parasites which are highly de-evolved. A lot of their functions are basically just filled in for by their hosts, could potentially readapt to these new conditions. Very de-evolved parasites could regain new functions that are actually suited to the new conditions, and we actually see parasites regain their independent function. That would be so cool. That has been a concept I've wanted to do for so long. An ecosystem of reformed parasites. I've always thought that would be sick as hell. This is especially inspired by one of my favorite genres. Well, technically they're just known as a class right now, but Microsporidia I've always thought are really cool. but the possible like physiological like oddities that would come from having an ancestry as a parasite would be so cool to see, like how these organisms would compose themselves. That would be so cool. Now, if I had to talk about another example that I really like, I don't know much about the detail of its creation process, but the Sea of Polynices, or Polynices, I'm kind of stupid, is also one of my favorite projects. It's pretty cool. They do some really interesting stuff there. It's got a lot of really cool forms, and I would just check it out anyways. It's just really neat. Oh yeah, speaking of cool things, I forgot I actually do have some models of some guys here. So first we have this thing. These are just some basic Blender kind of topology things I did like a long time ago. And you'll see that this dude is asymmetrical, and it might look like he swims with that tail thing, but I believe he either just pulls himself with it or he can also swim with it. Like he can pull himself forward and scoop up dirt with that little notch, and then it kind of goes into that mouth hole. I think it does that, and it might also be able to swim. I'm not sure, but this is the first one. Looks pretty cool. The next one we have is basically like a sideways fish with a couple pharyngeal slits. It's very strange. I believe this one was designed to possibly also be a magnetotroph, but I still never established if magnetotrophs were specifically like its own kingdom of single-celled organisms or something else. So yeah. And then we have this little kind of tripod starfish dude. Not sure if it actually moves or if it's sessile, but it also, as you can see, has those like pharyngeal slits up at the top, and it's kind of cool. All right, I originally meant for this video to be 20 minutes. I can't edit this much. It's an hour now, roughly an hour. I'm gonna go now. Bye.